This is section 4.4, which is Aquatic Ecosystems. It's the last section in chapter 4. Aquatic ecosystems are determined primarily by four factors. The first being depth. Depth determines how much light is going to make it into different parts of the ecosystem. The next one is flow. You can have standing water ecosystems or you can have flowing water ecosystems. And then we have temperature. And temperature is determined by latitude. The further you are from the equator, the lower the temperatures you're going to see. And then finally, chemistry. And chemistry is just the dissolved chemicals, the salt, the nutrients, and the oxygen that is in the water. Note, all of these are all abiotic factors. As for freshwater ecosystems, only 3% of the biosphere is freshwater. The rest is going to be saltwater. And a very little bit of that freshwater is going to be at the surface. The rest is going to be in groundwater or it's going to be trapped in ice caps at the poles. Freshwater ecosystems can be divided into flowing water and standing water ecosystems. As for your flowing water ecosystems, those can be divided down to rivers, streams, and creeks. All flowing water is going to be a stream. Creeks are a little bit smaller streams, and rivers are big streams. Now, the organisms that live in flowing water ecosystems, the animals we're talking about, they all have adaptations that allow them to live in those flowing water ecosystems. So, for example, insect larvae, they have hooks on them, and those hooks help them attach to different organisms that are in the flowing water. So those hooks can attach to the gills of fish, and what it can do is it can extract nutrients parasitically, and it can allow those insects to get bigger, but they can also attach themselves to different things within the water whether it be rocks or whether it be plants, and it can pick up nutrients that way. Trout, they have streamlined bodies, same with salmon. This allows them to swim in a swift current while minimizing their energy output. And then also, some fish have suckers, and this allows them to sit on the bottom of the stream very effortlessly and not put in a lot of work, which is going to save them energy for other things. In flowing water ecosystem, there is not much life at the source, and the source basically just means higher up in elevation where you don't have a whole lot of water. It's very low in nutrients. However, it is very high in dissolved oxygen. And there's more life at lower elevations, and there's much, much more biomass at lower elevations because of the higher nutrients. This right here, this is what a typical source of stream looks like. As you can see, there's lots of white in this, and that is basically the dissolved oxygen that is within that flowing water ecosystem. Now, as that water goes down and lower in elevation, what it does is it starts to slow down because there's less elevation that it's covering. As it gets down there, it's less steep, excuse me. And when it starts to slow down, it starts to deposit the sediment beneath it. So all the sediment that it carried from higher elevation gets deposited there. But also at lower elevation, there tends to be much, much more nutrients. As that water is flowing downhill, it's picking up nutrients from the it's from the dirt, it's picking up nutrients from the rocks, but it's also picking up nutrients from the different organic materials that are around that border the stream. And it's also picking, if it's an urban area, it's picking up nutrients from the runoff that's coming from the cities or from the farm fields too. Typically, lower elevations of streams have more nutrients than higher up. You can also see here, for those earth scientists out here, you can see some oxbow lakes that are created by these meandering streams. And this is a meandering stream because it just kind of goes and meanders all about. The other type of ecosystems that we have for freshwater are lakes and ponds. And with lakes and ponds, you have water flowing in and you have water flowing out. This allows different organisms to make it in, but it also allows those organisms to make it out. And then also within a lake and pond, you are going to have circulation. The thing that drives the circulation in a lake or a pond is going to be heat. And heat differs by the seasons. So typically during summer and winter, you have your levels of the lake don't move at all, but during fall and spring, you have lake turnover, where nutrients from the bottom start to rise to the top, and then also at the same time, you have different organic materials start to fall to the bottom, and you kind of have convection currents happening within that lake. That's called lake turnover. In the still water ecosystems, you have organisms called plankton, and plankton are just very weak swimming organisms that are the base of the food chains. In the background, you can see different pictures of plankton. The very base of the food chain in most instances is going to be phytoplankton, and phytoplankton, as you can tell by the root, it uses sunlight to produce energy. So energy for itself, but also to store energy too. So it can actually directly use the sunlight, and it is a plant in Kingdom Plantae. Zooplankton, which is an animal, it's in Kingdom Animalia. They eat the phytoplankton to get their energy, and these are the base of most aquatic food chains. As for freshwater wetlands, a wetland is basically any type of land that can be covered with water for the whole entire year or for part of the year. And we have three different types. We have bogs, which are acidic, and they are characterized by having lots of thick sphagnum moss. We also have marshes, which are shallow wetlands along rivers, and they flow very slowly. And then you have swamps, and these are marshes with trees and shrubs. The first picture right here, this is of a bog, and bogs are very typical of areas that were once glaciated. The bogs have a thick coating of sphagnum moss, and what that sphagnum moss does is it produces hydrogen ions. And as you remember from pH, things that have lots of hydrogen ions in solution, they tend to be more acidic. And when those hydrogen ions are produced, it makes the water more acidic, but this does not allow different decomposing bacteria to live in that water. So there's not a whole lot of life in these peat bogs. But what they also tend to do is they also they tend to preserve organic materials. So for example, here in Denmark, in a dried peat bog, they found a preserved human being, and they estimated that this person was killed between 400 BC and 400 AD. And the reason why their body was so well preserved was because there wasn't a lot of decomposing bacteria that could break this individual down because of that very acidic water. Here's a marsh right here. A marsh is just basically like a wetland, and it's kind of got shrubs and it's got grasses, but does not have a whole lot of trees. Although you do see a tree right here, but this is on the edge of the marsh. Prime habitat for ducks and other waterfowl. And then finally we have a swamp, and a swamp is dominated by trees, but it's also wet too. Estuaries, these are places where salt water mixes with fresh water, and the mixing is done by the tides. And depending on the time of the tide, you may have more fresh water or you may have more salt water in that estuary. Few herbivores in these estuaries, and the energy enters the food web as detritus. And detritus is basically just tiny pieces of organic material. Those tiny pieces of organic material, they come from higher up in the stream systems. And when they get to the estuaries, they slow down, and that organic material, that detritus, is deposited there. In estuaries, though, you have vast amounts of biomass, and they're wonderful spawning and nursery grounds for different species of fish, crabs, shellfish, and shrimp. The reason why they're such great nursery grounds is because they are protected. They're protected from the elements. They're protected from the waves. They're protected from the surf, and they have hardly any current at all flowing through them. So for those young organisms that aren't very strong swimmers, this is a great place for them to be, and there's lots of nooks and crannies for them to hide between the grasses and the different tree roots that are there too. Salt marshes. Within salt marshes, you have the grass that can grow above the low tide mark, and these salt tolerant grasses are going to be covered in salt water for part of the day, and then the rest of the time they're going to be exposed to oxygen. And then you also have seagrasses below the low tide, and those are covered with salt water all the time. And here is a picture of a salt marsh.